focus of this channel is to look at events throughout the history of the world, I also want to take a look at things that fascinate me that have to do with concepts surrounding the study of history. And one of those is folk memory. It's also known as collective memory or cultural memory. It's shared memories and knowledge that are passed down through generations over years, centuries, even millennia within a culture. It's informal transmission of history. It's oral tradition. Generally, it encompasses things that kind of tell about the various aspects about culture's identity and heritage. Things like historical events, stories of war, revolution, natural disaster, migrations, and transformative moments. Traditions and customs are also part of folk memory. You see that even now today, where you have customs that have been happening for thousands of years. Now, folk memory is also very much often intertwined with legend and folklore and myth, used to help explain natural phenomena, heroic deeds, or even cultural origins. Sometimes that does make it difficult in separating what is the truth within folk memory and what isn't. Is that, that mixture with the fantastic and the legendary. And then, of course, cultural practices and skills, certain things like farming techniques, medicinal remedies, and so forth, those are all handed down over generations and generations. Essentially old wives' tales about what you can take when you have a headache and you don't have any aspirin in the house, things like that. Now, folk memory does play a very crucial role in helping to maintain a culture's identity. It helps create a sense of belonging and a collective understanding of the society's values. But folk memory can also change over time as the new generations interpret and adapt the shared memories to what they are experiencing. Now, historians and anthropologists use folk memory quite frequently as a resource to help understand different cultures and societies. Folk memory can help provide an insight into how a society perceives its own identity. You can study the narratives, myths, and events that are shared through folk memory, not necessarily the historical record, to kind of gain an understanding of the values and beliefs that shape that group's identity. Then you also have historical events and changes. Folk memory is not an accurate historical record, but it can tell of past events and how they're interpreted and remembered by a particular culture. And then there's also the preservation of the traditions, and mention that in kind of what encompasses folk memory. Anthropologists work with communities to document and safeguard these aspects of their traditions that have just been passed down orally over the years. It helps to preserve knowledge about endangered traditions and customs. The folk memory can also help provide diverse narratives. You can often see the same story being told by different cultures, and therefore you get the different perspective. These stories can be told across different regions or communities, and it also helps with anthropologists and historians when they're looking to identify what regional differences are. Folk memory is also a good way to kind of have an account of collective trauma experienced by a community. And by studying those memories, it can provide insight into how societies in general can cope and recover from significant adversities. Now, there are a number of criticisms of using folk memory in academic settings. Probably the biggest one is the lack of verifiability. Folk memory is passed down orally and may not be documented or verified through written records or archaeological evidence. Now, this lack of verifiable sources can make it challenging to determine the reliability of the information in the folk memory, and you end up having situations where something could be dismissed until years later because it's part of oral tradition that's been passed down. As well, oral traditions are shaped by the experiences of the particular group, so therefore there's going to be a lot of biases and cultural norms that are included, as well as social expectations. And this can lead to distortion when you're retelling the story, as it may not necessarily reflect what actually happened. Of course, folk memory can also adapt and evolve over the years. You're essentially playing a game of telephone dating back millennia. And this also leads to the fragmentary nature of the entire oral memory. It's an incompleteness, and that can sometimes lead to an incomplete understanding of a society's past. There's also challenges in interpreting the folk memories and the oral traditions, because it can't really be done by an outsider. If somebody is not familiar with the culture they are studying, there's going to be misinterpretations and misrepresentations. And then there's the ethical concerns, because sometimes you're dealing with sensitive or traumatic historical events. And relying solely on folk memory without looking at the psychological impact on people can raise some ethical concerns when looking at folk memory and oral histories in an academic setting. And then, of course, there's transcultural interactions. You end up with a blending of narratives over the years. And what ends up coming, it may not represent the unique history of a specific community. Instead, it might actually be a story that encompasses a region or multiple cultures. And then, of course, oral traditions are always at the risk of being lost. Generally, folk memories come from cultures that are pre-literate. So these are stories that have just been passed down without necessarily being written down. And that can sometimes lead to issues. But despite those sort of critiques, folk memory is a valuable source of information when used with other academic methods and sources. It should also be approached with sensitivity, because you are looking at dealing with a culture's traditions, and you can't necessarily dismiss them or take them wholeheartedly. You have to work with that culture to be able to interpret the folk memory, to be able to create the historical record. Now, there's been a number of times where events or people that were initially considered to be mythological or legendary and were passed down through oral tradition or even through legends that were eventually put to paper. And it turned out that they've been historically real. Probably the most well-known is the city of Troy. Now, this was described in the epic poems The Iliad and the Odyssey, and it was always thought to be a fictional place, part of Greek mythology. But in the late 19th century, an archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann conducted a number of excavations in modern-day Turkey, and he found the remains of a city that matched the description of Troy. And this discovery eventually led to Troy was a real city. And there's now other works that have been done that have kind of shed light on the fact that the ancient and legendary Trojan War actually happened. Now, granted, the events that happened as part of the Trojan War likely did not occur. For example, the gods themselves joining the fight on behalf of one side or the other. But it is the fact that the Troy did exist. In fact, they've seen multiple buildings, rebuildings of Troy over the millennia. Now, granted, Schliemann was a very poor by today's standards archaeologist and ruined other things while he was there, but it still the folk memory or the myth was proven to be real. Now, another folk memory that was eventually put to paper in the medieval days was the story of King Arthur. Now, of course, King Arthur is believed to be 100% fictional. He did not exist. In fact, they're still discussing about whether there's any historical accuracy, but there are some who look at the actual historical record as well as the tales that were told. And by the time the stories of King Arthur got to when they were written down, it very well could have been that Arthur was a real figure who lived around the 5th or 6th century in England and helped to lead the defense of Britain in the post-Roman era against Anglo-Saxon invasions. Then there's the city of Akrotiri. It was on the island of Santorini in Greece, and it was buried during an eruption of Thera, also known as Santorini, around 1600 BCE. And for centuries, the city was unknown, but it was talked about in legend, and it was just kind of dismissed. It was even at times compared to Atlantis, another myth, but that myth has been thoroughly debunked. It's just a tale, a cautionary tale. But going back to Akrotiri, in the late 1960s, excavations around the site started, and they did find remarkably well-preserved buildings and artifacts that confirmed the actual ancient Minoan city. And it led to some credence to the stories and the myths passed down from the Greek culture that, yes, while these may have been written down, they were true. They weren't just legends. Then there's Alonso Meadow. in Newfoundland, Canada. Many people dismissed the Vinland sagas as just tales of the Viking explorers as they sailed from Iceland going to Greenland, and then from Greenland further west. And nobody actually believed that they had settled in North America, because there was never any traces of it found, and therefore they couldn't have happened. But they had actually created a settlement, and in the 1960s they discovered it on the northern tip of Newfoundland. And yes, the Vikings did actually make it to Lonzo Meadow. They did make it to Vinland, and that ended up becoming proving that this myth was reality. Now, another one is the Queen of Sheba. Now, she's included in a number of religious and historical texts, and her existence has always been debated. Now, she is mentioned in the Bible and the Quran, and she's described as a wealthy and wise ruler who visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. Now, they have discovered that there was a kingdom of Sheba in what is now modern-day Yemen, and even in Ethiopia. And they found evidence that the rulers of the region were women, when in many parts of the world in that time were men. And so while there isn't any direct evidence, the fact that the folk memory that was written down and passed down over the years could have been credible, that Sheba may have actually, or the Queen of Sheba may have actually existed and been a historical figure. Until then, it's not proven, but the women were rulers of Sheba, and whether or not the Queen of Sheba existed, or the one that visited Solomon nonetheless, anyway, whether that journey ever took place, that is where the debate is now. Now, the line between myth and historical reality does blur when it comes to folk memory, and it can sometimes be very difficult to unwind all of that. And not all myths and legends actually have a historical basis. So it does take scholarly investigation to look into these to make that determination as to whether or not something truly does exist. But it is fascinating nonetheless that you have instances of things written down or legends passed on for years and years and years that do turn out to have a factual base. There's even folk memories of lands that used to be that are now separated from mainland Australia, that they say at one point in time people could walk across, and there's legends and stories of how they used to walk across there to this island. That's an oral tradition that tells of how rising sea levels created that gap between the island, what is now the island, in mainland Australia. But folk memory does need to be, I guess, explored. It needs to be incorporated more, and needs to be understood as a path to help to understand cultural identities, historical events, and to preserve endangered traditions. The thing is, when looking at folk memory, you have to remember that it does have a lack of verifiability. There's always the potential for evolution and adaptation, and it's rather incomplete in nature. And of course, unless you are a part of that culture or have spent a lot of time studying that culture, there will always be challenges in interpretation. But this is our first look at some of the concepts in the academic study of history, and talking about folk memory, something that I do find very fascinating. And we'll be referencing some different historical events with folk memory, as looking throughout the entire life of this channel as different things that are passed down as legends that have now been proven to be reality, or where there's still some discussion to be had as to whether or not a legend is actually true. But I just kind of wanted to give a bit of a background.